Jurich smiled slightly at the irony. Cosimo had a gravelly voice of an old man, but the face of a child.
"Yes, Cosimo, give us a moment, please," replied Bodhran.
"A born killer, that one," answered Bodhran with a slight grin.
"He's surely not halfling. I've never seen his kind before. Of what race is he?" asked Jurich.
"Oh, he's something altogether different,"
answered Bodhran evasively.
"What he lacks in size, he more than makes up for in enthusiasm. Gets to be quite tiring at times. I liberated him from the servitude of an ashen elf outside Fairthale, a rather rude fellow, as I recall, over a game of chance of all things. Little Imp has been following me around ever since."
"You won him in a card game?" stated Jurich.
"You make it sound so crass, but yes," replied Bodhran. "In any event, I couldn't let you die before I repaid my debt, and the bard always keeps his promise."
They turned to see the crowd had dispersed to the far side of the bridge. They could hear the people shouting and axes at work. Bodhran stood in the middle of the bridge awaiting their return. The sound of the enemy's war drums was now pounding as it echoed off the bridge. As the enemy ranks narrowed to fit onto the bridge, the people of Kingsreach stopped what they were doing and stared in fear and awe. A line of figures weaved like a serpent away from the bridge, stretching nearly to the horizon.
"Just a moment,"
said Bodhran as he pulled a small drum from its pouch. He sped through the winding curves of the bridge toward the city, beating his drum in a short, steady rhythm. He was dangerously close when he stopped in his tracks and twisted to swing the lute from around his back. He struck a violent chord, sending a dust-gathering rush of wind in the enemy's direction. He immediately began beating his drum once again and raced away as the archer's arrows broke through the cloud of debris. The faster he played, the faster he ran until he turned to watch every arrow fall short.
"We now know their range,"
reported Bodhran as the crowd cheered his safe return. Theric and his rangers stepped forward and let fly a volley of their own. Their elven bows, being capable of much more distance and accuracy, did not fall short as the first two rows of the oncoming enemy dropped, riddled with arrows.
"Now?"
asked Cosimo.
"Cosimo help now?"
he repeated.
"Not now," answered Bodhran. "You may keep this safe," he added, handing over his lute.
Cosimo clutched the lute tightly with both hands, then wrapped his arms around it, pressing it to his chest. Bodhran turned and started toward the enemy once again.
"You are pressing your luck,"
commented Bodhran as the bard began to beat his drum.
"I think I'll have a word,"
answered Bodhran as he sped away. When Bodhran was just outside the archer's range, he stopped abruptly. The enemy ranks, expecting the same result, stopped their advance and raised their shields. Bodhran leaned forward and spoke a single word.
"Crescendo,"
he whispered as streams of golden runes flowed from his lips, clouding the air in front of him. The runes floated through the air toward the enemy, slowly spreading until they spanned the width of the bridge. All those in view watched in amazement as the glimmering symbols danced through the air. The enemy, no longer hesitating, pressed forward. Bodhran backed away, keeping a safe distance from them. As the enemy marched through the cloud of golden runes, some brushed them away while others ignored them completely. The crowd behind Bodhran grew hush in disappointment, while the onrushing enemy jeered at him. To those on both sides of the bridge, it appeared that Bodhran's spell had failed miserably. A jester's trick he picked up somewhere, no doubt, a mere distraction at best. Then, the bard began to play. Slow and haunting was the sound that came from the wooden flute. The runes began to spread, then multiply, dancing on the air to the rhythm and tempo of the song. The sound gradually grew louder and louder as the runes wafted through the air and in between the ranks until they blanketed the enemy formation. The bard's enchanted melody continued until it reached a deafening tone. Bodhran held one last note as the sound echoed off the hillside and back onto the bridge. The runes suddenly stopped, frozen in midair. There was a moment of tranquil anticipation as the last of the echoing waves of sound finished reverberating. This split second of dead silence was broken when, in perfect unison with his final note, the rune shattered in a violent explosion, sending a shower of razor-sharp, fiery golden shards down upon the enemy. The mayhem that ensued was of epic proportion. Some were blinded, others maimed. Many with no visible injuries stripped off their plate to try to rid themselves of the burning hot fragments that had penetrated the gaps in their armor. Those still standing attempted to retreat, but there was nowhere to run. The banks behind them blocked their way. The eastern end of the bridge was now littered with fallen enemy soldiers and mottled red with their blood. The citizens of Thronfast, watching the spectacle, rejoiced, then let out a sigh of despair as the enemy stepped over their fallen comrades and reformed their ranks, pushing forward.
"This is the line. We hold them here,"
shouted Jurich above the pounding of the drums and clap of marching feet.
Does he no help now?
He asked as he handed Bodhran his lute.
"Not now. Now, you must hide,"
answered the bard as he began to play a hymn of battle on the lute. As the first rank of 3 approached their position, Bodhran slammed his shield to the ground and let out a battle cry, stunning them in their tracks. He raised his cold dark steel axe and began to swing it above his head, its speed increasing with every rotation. He extended his arm and struck, cleaving the heads of 2 of the stunned enemies. As he raised his axe again, preparing to strike, Jurich drove his sword through the third man's midsection.
"An angry dwarf. How novel,"
jibed Bodhran. Bodhran Brimstone was a direct descendant of the original dwarven bloodline on Terminus, and despite the proud history of his cleric and paladin forefathers, Bodhran chose to become a warrior. His thirst for adventure had taken him to the far reaches of every known continent, and his prowess in battle earned him the moniker Bodhran the Bold. The mighty dwarf warrior continued to shout taunts at the enemy, infuriating them, goading them into focusing their attacks upon him. This allowed Jurich and Bodhran to take the offensive. The paladin used both his sword and shield as weapons as he bashed, then thrust in cadence with Bodhran's battle hymn. The bard alternated between his instrument and dual-wielding his short swords. His arms moved with such speed it created a whirlwind of blades. Wave after wave, they held their ground, but Jurich knew they could not hold the line indefinitely. And so did Lexer. Jurich could see no end to the enemy ranks in front of him. They stood shoulder to shoulder all the way back to the far side of the bridge. He could still hear the men working behind him, hacking at the timber supports. Suddenly, Jurich saw the enemy ranks breaking open in front of him like a ship's wake upon the water. They were making a path to let someone or something through. As it got closer, Jurich could see the enemy were being pushed aside by something big. As it appeared before him, Jurich would later recall this was the first time he felt genuine fear. Lexer had called up his champion, Marduk Dothrel, undefeated in single combat and the largest ogre anyone had ever seen. The hulking Dire Lord was in leather from the waist down. 2 thick leather straps crossed his chest over chainmail. On his head he wore a plate helm with 2 horizontal slits for the eyes. Blood-red plumage protruded from the top of the helm, making the dreaded ogre all the more imposing. On his back was a greatsword, forged in the unmistakable style of the Broken Maw. Jurich raised his sword and shield and stepped forward. As he got closer, Jurich could see Marduk's unprotected arms were covered in scars and lesions. Some from battle and others were carved into his flesh to form runes. Large festering boils protruded from his neck and shoulders. The ogre's stench stung Jurich's nostrils. As he approached, Marduk drew his greatsword and struck down with far more speed than Jurich thought possible. Jurich raised his shield just in time to stop the blow, the force of the greatsword splitting the shield nearly in half.
Jurich lunged at the ogre, but his sword did not penetrate the ringed chainmail. Marduk attacked again, this time knocking Jurich's sword from his hand. He lowered his shoulder, driving it into Jurich's chest, knocking the paladin back and stunning him. Marduk raised his greatsword high above his head and struck down with a finishing blow. Budrick, coming to Jurich's aid, leapt in front of him with his shield held high, taking a spear to the ribs for his effort. He pushed Jurich back as the greatsword struck his dwarven shield, deflecting the blow. The ogre's mighty weapon slammed down onto Budrick's helm, knocking him unconscious. Jurich, no longer stunned, felt a stinging pain in his leg. Marduk's redirected blow had slashed through a gap in his armor. He heard the enemy rally cries at the sight of blood streaming down his greaves. Jurich was now sitting up with his sword and lifeless comrade on the ground beside him. A feeling of dread fell over him as the towering Dire Lord stood in front of him, extending his left hand. He could hear the sound of steel on steel as the bard fought frantically to hold back the enemy. Marduk Dothrel, with his hand extended in front of him, began muttering the words to a dark incantation, channeling his Dire Lord ability to summon forth blood. A piercing pain struck Jurich as the blood from his wound was drawn from his body and into the air, forming a cloud of tiny red droplets. He heard Budrick scream out, now conscious and writhing in pain as his blood was also being drawn from the wound in his side. Marduk's eyes rolled back in his head as he called the blood to him and absorbed it, satiating his bloodlust and empowering himself. Marduk placed both hands back on his weapon, raised it above his head, and began to swing it in a circular motion. The world around Jurich began to slow as he felt himself losing consciousness. He saw the look of desperation as his eyes met the bard's, who then looked down at the fallen dwarf clutching the wound on his side. Jurich tried to spit, but his throat was bone dry. A feeling of peaceful helplessness came over him as memories from his past flashed before his eyes. He could barely remember his father's face, he thought. It had been so long ago. But his voice he now heard with perfect clarity.
Any man can fight when he's sure to win. No, show me the man who has the will to fight when he's sure to lose. To rise and rise again against the sea of uncertainty. To face his fears, and in doing so, defeat them. That's the man you must aspire to be, Jurich. So tell me, my son, which of these men will you be? What will you do in your moment of doubt?
Jurich answered then as he had answered so many years ago.
I will rise, father. I will fight.